Hello, everyone. I'm Miranda, and I live in Spain with my husband and two daughters. And today we're thinking about spiritual leadership. Obviously, there's lots of ways we can think about leadership, lots of elements to leadership. So, what is spiritual leadership? Could it mean regular leadership with prayer meetings? Or could it be that when we attain a certain level of spirituality, we become spiritual leaders and we're offering spiritual leadership? Well, I want to suggest that it's not either of those things. It's not about achieving something so that at a certain point we become spiritual leaders. It's more like an orientation that affects the way that we offer leadership. So I'm going to work with this idea that spiritual leadership is something that starts within, with the way that we lead ourselves. It works its way out into the way that we express our leadership in community with others, those in our teams. And ultimately, the fruit of spiritual leadership is that the ways of Jesus are expressed, are seen by others, are made known. So spiritual leadership can function not just in those places that we've traditionally thought of as spiritual places, like perhaps in our ministries or in our church leadership. Spiritual leadership is an orientation that can affect the way we lead in our families, the way we lead and bring influence in our neighborhoods. Political leadership can be expressed with this value for spiritual leadership. So as I was thinking about how we might unpack the elements of spiritual leadership, I thought of three words beginning with C. I hope this is helpful. I'll just offer it and see how it fits for you. First of all, I was thinking of the fact that we need to create a container within which our leadership functions. And that container is our own self-leadership. It's the way that we ourselves as leaders are being formed to become more like Jesus. So it's our own process of transformation or discipleship, if you like. I don't know if you've heard of Ruth Haley Barton, have you? She's written several books, and she's the founder of the Transforming Center, where she's worked with hundreds of leaders over the years. And famously, she said, the best thing any of us have to bring to leadership is our own transforming self. So I don't know if you've thought of maybe your skills or your personality or your years of experience as the best thing that you bring to your leadership. But Ruth Haley Barton is suggesting that, in fact, your process of formation, your discipleship, is the best thing that you bring to your leadership. Which means to say that yours and mine own process of being a disciple of Jesus, my journey of engaging intentionally in a process of growth, my willingness, in fact, to see my unhelpful patterns of reaction and behavior, and to make space for the Holy Spirit to engage me in those places, to teach me, to empower me to live differently, to do things differently. That is this kind of crucial container for the rest of my leadership expression, which means that we can't divorce our capacity to lead others well from our own inner reality as one who's being formed. So a good question to ask ourselves would be, how are we making space for God's Spirit to engage us in these deep places? Where we have things to learn, where we may also have things to unlearn in this process of becoming more like Jesus. Because I'm convinced that as we grow in listening and noticing and responding in the context of my own life with God, our lives with God, we also grow in our capacity to listen, notice, and respond in our leadership roles. So that's the first thing, the C of container. I hope that's a helpful word for us. The second word that came to mind is the word community. So going with this idea that spiritual leadership kind of starts within with how we lead ourselves, and then it gets worked out in the context of the relationships where our leadership is taking place. Leadership is a relational thing. We lead people. So as leaders, we have this amazing opportunity to create intentional spaces where we're inviting others into this process of transformation. And together, whatever our ministries are, whatever our activities are, we are being formed to be Jesus people who live and love like Jesus. And as we're bringing that into our communities, as we're helping to create spaces where that process is happening, we've got this at the back of our minds, this quote from Ruth Haley Barton, that the best thing that any of us can bring to our places of influence, to our leadership, as she said, is our own transforming self. So that goes for our team members just as much as for us ourselves. So somehow the way that I'm engaging in my process of formation with the Holy Spirit is getting expressed in the way that I relate to the people on my leadership team, on my wider ministry team, the way that I have conversations, the way that I engage conflict, the way that I'm willing to look at the things that I've done that haven't been helpful for other people. So this inner journey is getting expressed in the community of our team, which means that we see more love at work in our teams as we ourselves become more loving. And we see more attentiveness to the Spirit as we ourselves become more attentive to the Spirit. And we see a quickness to respond to the nudges of the Spirit as we ourselves are learning to respond quickly to the nudges of the Spirit. So as leaders who have this orientation towards spiritual leadership, we will openly talk about and notice and encourage a process of change among us in our teams. There's no shame in the fact that we have to grow and change. We're all learners. We're never done growing. It doesn't matter how old we are or how many years of experience we have. We're always in need of the Spirit of God to teach and empower us. And that value for formation, for discipleship, is a value that can impact the culture of our teams. And as that happens, our orientation as a community becomes more and more attuned to God and God's ways, because we're creating space for honesty, for listening, practices that change us. We're consciously gathering around the presence and the activity of God. So I don't know what that looks like in your team, in your community. That would be a really great thing to reflect on once you've finished watching this little talk. So we start with the container, this personal process of formation gets worked out in community. And then the third word beginning with C that I thought of is that the overflow of our leadership, the outcome, the fruit of our leadership is always Christ-centered. It's always Jesus first. I mean, it does make me laugh a little bit because of the old joke about the kid in Sunday school whose answer to every question was Jesus, because surely that's the right answer. But yes, in fact, when we're leading with this orientation towards being spiritual leaders, the fruit of what we do will be expressions of Jesus' character and Jesus' ways in our locations, in our communities, in our neighborhoods. And others will be drawn to this Jesus who's being expressed among us. Because we all know, don't we, that we can have ministries that look productive and effective. There's a lot of activity happening. There's a lot of meetings. And yet there's in some way, a lack of a true expression of Jesus and his ways, because maybe we're not making enough space for people to encounter Jesus as part of how we are together. And conversely, we can go through dry periods, or maybe we're part of a team that's working in a particularly dry season or place in terms of outward productiveness, the actual things that we're able to do. And yet we're allowing the Spirit to work deeply within us, individually and corporately. And that process will ultimately bear fruit in the spaces around us. as a mission, we are renowned for being visionary. We value being visionary. And it's true that we're called to be kingdom people in the world, to see kingdom flourishing in our locations in all these little ways. And ultimately, our primary vision is Christ himself. So we, as as those who are oriented towards spiritual leadership, we have this compulsion to be Christ-centered, to keep bringing people back to Jesus, and then figuring out what that looks like in our ministries, in our activities. So those are my thoughts on spiritual leadership, and there are many other things that could be said about spiritual leadership. My real desire is that together we're multiplying teams of people that are able to recognize and respond to the presence and the activity of God. And to do that, which is incredibly powerful in the world and countercultural, but to do that, we first have to lead ourselves. We have to cultivate this container for our leadership, and we have to figure out how to be discipling communities in the way that we function together. We're being formed. And then we will see that spilling over into the places where we live and work as we keep our primary vision on Jesus.